Hello, I'm Tom Campbell, Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I'm here with Gary Tintereau, Curator of the exhibition Picasso in the Metropolitan Museum. Gary, this is a landmark show of about 300 works by Picasso drawn from our own collections. You've chosen to hang them chronologically to provide a full survey of his life and his work. And we start off with the year he arrives in Paris, 1901. And we have paintings that, in fact, if one didn't know, one might always attribute them to Toulouse-Lautrec.
Yeah.
This was the milieu into which he came.
Absolutely. Picasso said, great artists don't borrow, they steal. And Picasso was like a magpie, and wherever he went, he had an incredible instinct for knowing what was hot at that moment and what style in which to work. And when he arrived in Paris at the height of the Art Nouveau poster-making period with Jules Chéret and Toulouse-Lautrec, the visual landscape of Paris were all those great posters, and the nightlife of Montmartre was this compelling subject matter.
And so here, the signature image of the first gallery, the Harlequin. Do we see the early Picasso emerging from this cutting and pasting?
Absolutely. I mean, cutting and pasting is an interesting analogy because that's just what he was doing. And what's so fascinating about this, because of our work on other exhibitions and projects, we're able to know quite precisely what Picasso saw before he made this picture. So when you look at the floral background, it might remind you of our La Berceuse by Van Gogh in the Annenberg collection hanging here at the Met.
That's right, Rich. Yep.
And indeed, we were able to determine that that painting was in Volar's gallery in June 1901, when Picasso had his own exhibition in Volar's gallery in June 1901. The blue and green color harmony reminds one of Gauguin's late work, his Tahitian paintings, that Volar had recently exhibited in Paris, and certainly had some in his storeroom. So he knew how to make a compelling image, I mean, what we might call an iconic image because of its frontality, its placement. That's something that he learned early on and repeats constantly through his career. He's only 19 years old when he paints this, and it's such an extraordinary masterpiece.
Now, there's a gaiety, there's a vibrancy of coloration in the paintings in this gallery, which we see falling away as we go through into the next gallery, where the coloration becomes predominantly blue.
Yeah, his mood shifts dramatically at the end of 1901. He's in Paris, and the death of his friend Carlos Casagemas by suicide begins to weigh heavily on him. He began to paint outcasts, the marginalized. He himself seemed to develop a morbid fear of blindness, which was the typical result of promiscuity in those days, syphilis. He frequented an asylum for women near Montmartre called Saint-Lazare, which was a public hospital for women with venereal disease. And there he found a number of his subjects for his Blue Period pictures.
Including this blind man?
Yeah. This is more sacred than profane, because as you can recognize, it's the Eucharist, bread and wine, and this poor man, but he's blind. To me, it's a fantastic painting because of its secular scene, which is a marginal man, an outcast, what we would call a homeless person today, infused with this spectral light of El Greco, giving us a timeless scene about Christian symbolism.
Now, I know you've done a lot of research with infrared and X-rays. Do we know in the painting process, was this an image that Picasso arrived at early, or was this a kind of a labored image that, there was much experimentation?
Yeah. Dramatic discovery here was an entire painting underneath, which is a crouching nude from the Blue Period, which is visible in a famous painting by Picasso called La Vie in the Cleveland Museum of Art. And it shows a couple, sort of Adam and Eve-like, in Picasso's studio with two canvases visible, one on an easel, one leaning against the easel. The one leaning against this easel is The Crouching Nude, which is a painting that scholars have been looking for years, and now we know where it is. It's underneath this picture, precisely. And because he was so poor and canvas was a luxury, it was more convenient for him to paint over something that wasn't going to be sold anyway.
Now, how long does this blue, this melancholy period last for?
I would say it began in Paris at the end of 1901, and it continued straight through to his return to Paris from Barcelona in spring 1904. It was spring, it was Paris, things lightened up. He found a new subject, which was the itinerant acrobats, whom he paints in the Rose period, and which we have a very fine collection of.
In changing his palette in this Rose period, is he reflecting contemporary thought about the symbolism of colors, or is it just an instinctive aesthetic decision?
I think it's all those things. But it was a conscious aesthetic choice as well. I mean, the two were operating together. But in coming into the pink period and choosing this harmony of pink and blue, let's say, with the actor, he's developing his own color scheme that is unlike those of anyone else.
And we're getting an ever more marked distortion with the figures, a freedom to mix figures, shapes, to an emotional and evocative purpose.
Yeah, I think, the key thing, if we're looking for stylistic influences, is that he leaves El Greco, although in the attenuation here, we could say there's still a hint of El Greco left in this figure, and we think of pictures by El Greco where the hands are so nervous and electric. So he has that here, but he essentially leaves El Greco behind for Ang when he goes from the blue period to the rose period. And all three of these pictures are informed by the example of Ang. So of course, the great Oedipus and the Sphinx at the Louvre, and so that's where the final gesture that he arrives at is taken straight from that picture. There, you'll recognize Bronzino's portrait of a young man with a hand on hip, which was then reworked by Ang in the Comte de Pastoret, the portrait now at the Art Institute of Chicago, which he then quotes more fully here. And he thought it was a swagger pose, as it is, and he used it in these two depictions of circus performers.
So we can find resonances within our own collections here that speak to the development of Picasso's oeuvre.
Absolutely.
Now, to our right, we've got the famous portrait of Gertrude Stein. Would you call that a Rose period painting?
Well, it comes right at the end of the Rose period, and that's what's so interesting. But he's looking for non-classical sources. He's also looking at sculpture.
The hands could be straight out of Ingres.
Precisely.
The upper torso is going in an entirely new direction.
Yeah, and that's what we see in the next room.
Yeah. What's going on here? How did he get here?
There are a number of things. He is introduced to African art by Henri Matisse, who brought a Congolese statue over to Gertrude Stein's apartment, and they were marveling at the carving. And he then went to the Ethnographic Museum, looked at oceanic art, and he made an amalgam of all these, what used to be called primitive traditions of art making, and conceived a very sculptural approach. There's something very strong and animalistic about them. This is what he's gaining from primitive art.
We've got two very identical images here. What's happening here?
That's just spectacular, because no curator would be allowed to buy two works that are so close. You would just have to choose. Do you want this one or do you want that one? But because so many of the works were given to the museum, we have the great luxury of seeing these two works, which are probably done on the same day, if not the day after. This one, I think, done first in pencil with the blue washes, and here with much stronger application of washes.
Accented.
Precisely. And where he begins, he looks at the figure here, he makes these wonderful arc-like shapes, and then he begins to shade in pencil where he wants to create the relief. And here, knowing just where that's going to happen, it comes out with greater sureness.
There's a drawing over here in the corner you especially cherish.
Standing Female Nude, 1910. I think it's the greatest Cubist drawing there is. But what I love about the drawing is this marvelous scaffold that is organic and intuitive. It's not a scaffold that an architect or an engineer would make, but we can sense the human body very strongly. Everything has been broken up into these formal elements, cubes, planes, figures. It's an exaggeration and extension of all sorts of things, but predominantly it's Cézanne right now. He's looking at late paintings by Cézanne, the way the brushstrokes are applied, and the way they act like mosaics to, at a distance, assemble a picture. It also is in very good condition.
Mm-hmm. How long does this go on?
Picasso ends his first big flush of Cubism with the close of the war, when he's invited by Jean Cocteau and Serge Diaghilev to work on the Ballet Russe. He goes to Rome, he works on a ballet, he meets a dancer, a Russian dancer named Olga Koklova, he marries, and his life changes dramatically at that point, and I would say his art does too, and that's what we can see in the next room.
Changes in what respect?
He becomes neoclassical again. Having been to Italy, having gone to Herculaneum and to Pompeii, seeing those great frescoes completely changes his perception. He makes marvelous heads like this that are a direct reflection of his Italian experience. But these women are all, in one way or another, his wife Olga. These two pastels both come from Schofield Thayer, who was a remarkable American collector, very important in literary history, the first to publish T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound in America. He had a magazine called The Dial, which was tremendously influential, and he wanted to buy works of art that he could reproduce in his magazine.
Now, in this gallery, we're predominantly looking at paintings and drawings, but I know in the next gallery you have many linoleum cuts. It was clearly a medium he loved working in, and it's really inventive.
And he invented new processes. So when you look, for example, at this suite here of transformation of the satyrs and the bulls with the starry sky, this is a reductive lino cut, which is to say he's using the same block, and he continues to scoop away more precisely in order to make the different color patches. Because for work like here, the woman after Cranach, he was very unhappy with the problems of registration, and you can see even the red block for her dress doesn't line up where it should, and he found that very disturbing. And so with his printer, he developed this reductive technique, and we see an explosion in his art.
And was he making linoleum cuts at the same time that he was painting oils, or does he kind of have periods working in the different medium?
Certainly there are moments when he favors one or the other, but I think he loved the transformation. When he was working on a painting, he would often revise the pictures, and that's what we've seen through infrared and X-ray. But he would lose the previous states. And what he loved with printmaking is that he could hold on to the previous states. He could pull a print and then go back to the plate or to the block and continue to revise it. And he loved seeing the progressive stages of metamorphosis, because for Picasso, it was all about transformation, metamorphosis, creativity.
Many of our paintings are on display most of the time, but this is the part of the show that is really unusual.
He's painting as well, and drawing, never stops, making sculpture. But I think his printmaking, more than any other medium, show his creativity and expression best.
The exhibition is on through August the 1st, but of course, even after it closes, many of our Picasso paintings will be on display in our permanent galleries. I hope you have the opportunity to visit. Thank you.